The first mobsters didn't wear suits. They wore robes, armor, and the occasional halo. Long before Al Capone, there were pirates with payrolls, priests running credit schemes, and emperors who shook down their own provinces. Crime didn't evolve from civilization. It built it. Every civilization builds a system of rules, and wherever there are rules, someone learns to sell exceptions. Organized crime isn't a modern invention. It's as old as agriculture, as familiar as trade. When societies began to specialize, when surplus and property appeared, so did theft. But theft alone doesn't make an underworld. The real birth of organized crime came when people realized that order could be sold just as easily as it could be enforced. The first gangsters weren't rebels. They were entrepreneurs in a world without police. In the city-states of Mesopotamia, 4,000 years ago, the first laws against corruption were already being written. Hammurabi's Code, carved around 1750 BCE, listed punishments for merchants who cheated weights, priests who pocketed temple offerings, and judges who took bribes. The fact that those laws existed tells us something. People were doing it often enough to make it worth legislating. In ancient Egypt, where grain was currency, black markets grew out of necessity. Pharaohs taxed in wheat, stored it in silos, and redistributed it during famine. But inspectors and scribes learned to skim their share. The so-called tomb robbery papyri from around 1100 BCE record organized bands looting royal tombs, bribing guards, and fencing treasures through corrupt temple officials. Crime wasn't chaos. It was coordination. By the time the Greeks took to the sea, piracy had already become an industry. Thucydides noted in the 5th century BCE that early Greek heroes, like Odysseus, were half warrior, half pirate. Raiding coastal towns was a respectable trade until city-states got rich enough to call it dishonorable. By the 3rd century BCE, piracy in the Aegean was practically a multinational operation. The Illyrians and Cilicians ran fleets that outmatched small navies. They didn't just rob merchants. They extorted entire regions. Villages paid protection fees in grain and silver to be spared. When Rome expanded eastward, it discovered that the Mediterranean had two governments, the Republic on land and the pirates at sea. Rome fought back the way empires always do, by becoming a little like the thing it hated. In 67 BCE, the Senate granted Pompey Magnus emergency powers to eradicate piracy. He divided the Mediterranean into 13 naval districts, cleared them one by one, and resettled captured pirates inland. It was one of history's first anti-crime campaigns, executed with military precision. But Pompey's campaign was financed with confiscated loot, and his officers were paid through patronage. His success created a network of loyal men who owed him everything. Rome discovered what every empire eventually learns. You don't kill the underworld, you absorb it. Once the pirates were gone, corruption just moved inland. The Republic's tax system depended on publicani, private contractors who collected taxes in the provinces and kept the overage as profit. Governors like Verres in Sicily in the 70s BCE turned extortion into an art form, demanding gifts of grain, silver, and art under threat of military punishment. Cicero's prosecution of Verres reads like the world's first mob trial. Witness intimidation, bribes, and political cover-ups included. By the time the Republic collapsed, graft had become a parallel economy. The empire didn't have organized crime beneath it. It had organized crime within it. China, meanwhile, was developing its own version of the same idea. During the Qin and Han dynasties, roughly 221 BCE to 220 CE, secret brotherhoods and gangs emerged in regions where the emperor's reach was weak. Some were ex-soldiers, some were merchants, some were rebels who offered justice where the bureaucracy couldn't. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE was as much a religious uprising as it was a criminal network, an organization with supply lines, coded messages, and a chain of command. By the Tang dynasty, China's underworld had become structured. Thieves' guilds and secret fraternities with initiation rituals, symbols, and profit-sharing agreements. One Tang record describes the Brotherhood of the Bamboo Hat, a traveling network of gamblers and extortionists that controlled markets and inns across provinces. They were the ancestors of what the world would later call the Triads. By the Middle Ages, Europe had rediscovered organized crime in miniature. England's countryside was crawling with outlaw bands like the Folevilles and the Cotterell gang. Noble-born criminals who kidnapped merchants, robbed abbeys, and bribed sheriffs. In 1311, the Folevilles murdered a judge in broad daylight, then bought their way back into favor. Their noble patrons shielded them. Their victims paid tribute for protection. The pattern was the same one Sicily would perfect centuries later. In Italy, the fall of the Roman Empire left a vacuum that the church couldn't fill. Local enforcers called campieri collected dues from peasants to keep bandits away, then became the bandits themselves. By the 1800s, those rural networks had matured into the Sicilian mafia. In China, the same logic ruled the coast. The Song dynasty made salt a state monopoly. That meant someone would inevitably smuggle it. By 1200 CE, entire families in Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces made fortunes trafficking illegal salt under the protection of bribed officials. The government knew. It just preferred the income. Crime was tolerated so long as it was organized. Even religion blurred the lines. The Knights Templar, founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, became one of medieval Europe's first international banks. They handled deposits, letters of credit, and gold transfers across continents. When King Philip IV of France destroyed them in 1307, accusing them of heresy, he wasn't purging corruption. He was erasing his creditors. By the end of the medieval period, crime had evolved into something resembling its modern form, hierarchical, profitable, and indistinguishable from politics. Pirates ran shipping routes, smugglers managed trade, bandits acted as unofficial tax collectors. Governments learned from them, copied their methods, and often relied on them. The line between law and lawlessness blurred until it was mostly theoretical. Every empire produced its own underworld, and every underworld learned to imitate empire. Organized crime was never the opposite of civilization. It was its reflection, the flexible twin that filled in what the law couldn't reach. When authority broke down, the underworld stepped in. When the state grew strong again, it simply absorbed the gangsters, renamed them officials, and pretended the problem was solved. By the dawn of the industrial age, the old black markets had become the backbone of a new global economy. The criminals of the ancient world had dealt in silver, grain, and salt. Their descendants would soon deal in nations. Organized crime has always borrowed the language of honor to disguise the business of fear. You can tax with a sword or with an oath. Either way, the money moves the same. The modern criminal brotherhoods that shaped the last 2 centuries didn't invent corruption. They professionalized it. And their power came not from chaos, but from rules. The Sicilian mafia, the Chinese triads, the Japanese Yakuza, the Russian Vori v Zakone. Each of them was born in a moment when the state collapsed, when the law stopped working and loyalty became the only currency left. Their members liked to say they weren't criminals, they were men of honor. But the truth is simpler. They were governments waiting to happen. In Sicily, it began with lemons. In the mid-1800s, the citrus boom turned the island into one of Europe's most profitable exporters. But Sicily was poor, rural, and barely governed. The Bourbon monarchy in Naples sent officials who couldn't read the language, let alone enforce law in the countryside. Wealthy landowners hired armed guards called campieri to protect estates, crops, and laborers. The guards formed networks, traded favors, and demanded payments from those they protected. By the 1860s, after Italy unified, these networks filled the power vacuum left by the retreating Bourbons. The new Italian state was supposed to bring order. Instead, it outsourced it. Palermo's elites paid private security, peasants paid for protection, and both knew better than to question it. In 1876, an Italian parliamentary report finally named what everyone already knew: that a sect of malefactors controlled local elections, courts, and contracts. That was the first time the word mafia appeared in official print. But the mafia didn't see itself as a gang. It saw itself as a system, a parallel society built on 3 rules: silence, omerta, loyalty to the family, and the obligation to repay any favor, no matter how long it took. A mafioso wasn't an outlaw. He was a broker, a mediator, the man who made things happen when bureaucracy didn't. The historian Leopoldo Franchetti called it a state within the state. He wasn't wrong. By the early 1900s, the Sicilian mafia had perfected the art of invisibility. Its members dressed modestly, spoke softly, and preferred favors over bloodshed. Murder was for amateurs. Real power came from debt, reputation, and silence. When they emigrated to America in the late 19th century, they carried that structure across the Atlantic, where it would fuse with immigrant ambition and prohibition money to form something even bigger: the American mafia. Across the world in China, the same conditions produced a different vocabulary for the same idea. The triads traced their lineage to the 17th century, when the Qing dynasty replaced the Ming and chaos followed. Displaced soldiers, monks, and smugglers formed sworn brotherhoods to resist the Manchu invaders. They called themselves Tian Di Hui, the Heaven and Earth Society. Their symbols were religious. The triangle represented harmony between heaven, earth, and man. But brotherhoods built on resistance eventually need income. The triads turned to gambling, opium, and protection rackets. By the 19th century, their rituals were elaborate. Initiates recited oaths before an altar, drank animal blood mixed with wine, and pledged to die rather than betray the brotherhood. Each group was autonomous, but linked through secret codes and mutual respect. The Qing tried mass executions, amnesties, and infiltration. Nothing worked. When foreign powers carved up China in the late 1800s, the triads adapted, smuggling weapons, drugs, and people through the treaty ports the British had opened. By the time Sun Yat-sen overthrew the Qing in 1911, triad leaders were funding both revolutionaries and warlords, hedging their bets like bankers. Under Mao, many fled to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, transforming again into the 14K, Sun Yat-sen, and Wo Xingwo societies that still dominate the region's underworld. Their business model was simple: 1 foot in the street, one foot in politics. In Japan, the story ran parallel. The Yakuza's roots go back to the 1600s, when Japan's Tokugawa shogunate imposed strict class hierarchies. Those left out, gamblers, peddlers, street enforcers, organized for survival. Two groups emerged: the Bakuto, who ran illegal gambling houses, and the Tekiya, who controlled markets and festivals. Over centuries, these outcasts built their own moral code. Ninkyo-do, the chivalrous way. By the Meiji era, 1868 to 1912, Japan's modernization turned the Yakuza into a national institution. Their leaders called themselves Oyabun, fathers. Their followers, Kobun, children. They offered protection, employment, and belonging. The same social functions the government failed to provide. During World War II, many worked with nationalist groups and intelligence agencies. After the war, the American occupation cracked down on black markets, which only made them richer. By the 1960s, the Yakuza were running construction, entertainment, and politics. Their front companies built skyscrapers in Tokyo and highways for the Olympics. Even now, they exist in plain sight, registered offices, business cards, and all. The irony is that the Yakuza built legitimacy through ritualized transparency. Everyone knows who they are, but no one can quite define what they do. They attend funerals, make donations, mediate disputes. Their tattoos, the elaborate irizumi, mark them not as outlaws, but as adherents to a code. In their own mythology, they are not criminals, but keepers of an older Japan. And then there's Russia, where organized crime was practically state-sponsored. The Vori v Zakone, thieves in law, emerged in the Soviet prison camps of the 1930s. The Gulag system was a breeding ground for hierarchy. Prisoners developed their own code: absolute loyalty to the thieves' world, refusal to cooperate with the state, rejection of official labor, and obedience to the collective. Tattoos recorded rank and biography: cat for thief, church domes for convictions, stars for authority. During World War II, Stalin drafted thousands of prisoners into the army. Those who fought were branded traitors by the old Vori, splitting the underworld into two camps: the pure thieves, who upheld tradition, and the Suki, who cooperated with power. After the war, the two sides waged a bloody internal conflict known as the Bitch Wars. Fought inside the camps with knives and sharpened spoons. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Vori came out of the prisons and into the boardrooms. They laundered state assets, seized shipping lines, and infiltrated banks. By the mid-1990s, Russian organized crime controlled an estimated 40% of private enterprises. Figures like Vyacheslav Ivankov, Yaponchik, and Semyon Mogilevich turned the underworld into a multinational conglomerate: extortion, oil, arms, and cybercrime, all under one umbrella. What all these organizations shared wasn't ethnicity or geography. It was the idea that the law could be replaced by loyalty. They built parallel moral universes, systems of justice, punishment, and reward that imitated the state and often did its job better. They called themselves families, societies, brotherhoods, orders. And each had its own theology. The mafia believed in the sanctity of silence. The triads sanctified rebellion. The Yakuza glorified loyalty. The Vori worshipped defiance. But beneath the poetry, they all practiced the same business: control through fear disguised as fraternity. To an outsider, these codes looked noble. Inside, they were mathematical. Silence meant survival. Betrayal meant death. Every initiation ritual, every tattoo, every blood oath was an algorithm for stability. The genius of organized crime was that it learned to manufacture trust in a world that had lost it. As the 20th century approached, these brotherhoods were no longer confined to their homelands. Steamships, telegraphs, and migration turned them global. Sicilian mafiosi settled in New York and Chicago. Triads moved drugs and guns through colonial Hong Kong. Russian thieves found work in Berlin, Istanbul, and Brooklyn. The Yakuza laundered yen through Swiss banks. Crime followed commerce, because commerce had always followed crime. By 1900, organized crime had evolved into a networked species, local in accent, global in reach. It had its own diplomacy, its own economy, and soon, its own heroes. The world was about to outlaw alcohol, and in doing so, it would create the golden age of the mob. The 20th century didn't invent organized crime, it franchised it. For the first time in history, the global economy, mass migration, and prohibition collided to make the underworld scalable. Before, crime was local. A town, a port, a province. Now, it could stretch from Havana to Chicago, from Naples to New York. The gangsters didn't just exploit modernity, they understood it. When the U.S. Congress passed the Volstead Act in 1919, outlawing the sale and transport of alcohol, they created the largest business opportunity in criminal history. Demand didn't vanish. It simply changed suppliers. Within months, a network of smugglers, distillers, and fixers sprang up along the Canadian border and the Atlantic coast. Whiskey from Montreal, rum from the Caribbean, moonshine from the Appalachian Hills, all funneled into an underground economy worth billions in today's dollars. The faces of this empire became folklore. Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish gambler who bankrolled half of New York's illegal liquor trade. Al Capone, the South Side enforcer who turned Chicago into a private kingdom. And Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the Sicilian-born architect who transformed scattered gangs into a corporate syndicate. Capone's Chicago was the laboratory. His organization employed over 1,000 people, drivers, accountants, lawyers, hitmen, bookkeepers, generating an estimated $100 million a year. During the late 1920s, he controlled breweries, trucking lines, and speakeasies. He bribed police, judges, and politicians with industrial efficiency. Violence was simply branding, a reminder that the city's real mayor wore a fedora. But it was Luciano who turned crime into an institution. Born in Palermo in 1897, he arrived in New York as a child and rose through the Italian street gangs of the Lower East Side. He watched older bosses like Joe, the Boss Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano tear each other apart in the so-called Castellamarese War of 1930 to 31. An internecine struggle that killed dozens and terrified the city. When the smoke cleared, Luciano had both men eliminated. He reorganized the survivors into the 5 families: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, and created the Commission, a board of directors to settle disputes and divide territory. No more gang wars, he said. There's enough to go around. Luciano understood something his predecessors didn't. Violence was bad for business. The mob didn't need to rule the streets if it could rule the docks, the unions, and the politicians. The mafia's real power came from its invisibility. By the late 1930s, New York's underworld looked less like a gang and more like a portfolio. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, labor racketeering, all managed through legitimate fronts. The same story was playing out across the world. In Japan, The Yakuza dominated black markets during the Allied occupation. In China, triads ran opium and gold between Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. In Italy, the mafia re-emerged after World War II, rebuilding networks destroyed by fascism. The Allies themselves inadvertently revived it. When the U.S. invaded Sicily in 1943, American intelligence recruited local mafiosi like Calogero Vizzini to identify fascists and maintain order. After the war, those men became mayors, councilors, and businessmen. The mafia had gone from outlawed to useful overnight. In America, war created new opportunities. With the U.S. government focused on Europe and the Pacific, the home front became a playground for syndicates. The black market for rationed goods, gasoline, meat, silk, sugar, was enormous. The same networks that smuggled whiskey now moved stolen fuel and fake ration books. The mob was so deeply embedded that even the government needed it. During the World War II, the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence struck a secret deal with the mafia to protect New York's docks from Axis sabotage. The operation was codenamed Underworld. In exchange, Luciano, then imprisoned, received a sentence reduction. Patriotism was negotiable. By the 1950s, organized crime had become America's unspoken partner. The mob had infiltrated labor unions, construction companies, and casinos. In Las Vegas, Bugsy Siegel, a charismatic associate of Luciano's, built the Flamingo Hotel with mob money, creating the blueprint for a city that would one day be powered entirely by crime. When Siegel was murdered in 1947, it wasn't just revenge. It was corporate restructuring. His investors wanted results. The post-war boom only strengthened the underworld. America's highways made smuggling easier. Suburbs made anonymity possible. The GI Bill gave returning soldiers small businesses that doubled as fronts. In Cuba, under Fulgencio Batista, U.S. mobsters opened casinos and nightclubs that laundered millions. Havana was the mob's tropical stock exchange. By 1958, Meyer Lansky, the quiet accountant behind Luciano's empire, had turned Cuba into a cash cow, with profits flowing back to New York, Miami, and Chicago. But organized crime's real triumph wasn't geography. It was legitimacy. The mob mastered the art of the double life. Frank Costello, Luciano's successor, hosted senators in his apartment while controlling gambling rackets across the East Coast. He called himself a businessman. The newspapers called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. The FBI called him untouchable, until television changed everything. In 1950, the Kefauver Senate hearings on organized crime brought the mob into America's living rooms for the first time. Black and white footage showed gangsters squirming under the glare of senators and cameras. One of them, Costello, was asked, "What have you done for your country?" He hesitated. His hands shook. The public saw what myth never had: fear. Overnight, the word mafia became common vocabulary. J. Edgar Hoover, who had spent decades denying the mob's existence, could no longer pretend. Still, exposure didn't destroy organized crime. It evolved. The syndicates learned to go quieter, to trade Tommy guns for accountants. They diversified into narcotics, real estate, and politics. The model spread worldwide. Italian, American, Russian, and Asian syndicates cross-pollinated, sharing routes and tactics. By mid-century, organized crime had become a global infrastructure. It controlled ports, markets, and governments. It supplied vice and stability in equal measure. And it had learned something every empire eventually discovers. It's easier to buy the law than to break it. The mob was no longer a story of rebellion. It was a story of inheritance. How power moves through generations, how loyalty mutates into bureaucracy, and how crime becomes indistinguishable from capitalism. By the time the Cold War began, the mafia, the triads, and the yakuza had become quiet partners in global politics. Intelligence agencies, dictators, and corporations would soon find that, in the right light, a criminal network looks an awful lot like plausible deniability. Governments have always borrowed from criminals, but the 20th century made it official. When the world split between capitalism and communism, both sides needed things they couldn't admit to needing. Smugglers, fixers, and mobsters filled the gap. In the Cold War, organized crime stopped being the enemy and became an instrument, a black market foreign policy. It started in Italy, where the mafia's resurrection was practically a U.S. government project. When Allied troops landed in Sicily in 1943, they were met not by resistance, but by silence. A silence maintained by men who still controlled the countryside. The American Office of Naval Intelligence had already struck a deal with Sicilian mobsters through their imprisoned godfather, Lucky Luciano, to secure the New York docks. In return, Luciano's network was asked to help identify fascists and smooth the invasion. It worked. When the Allies took Palermo, local mafia leaders were installed as mayors and police chiefs. For Washington, it was a victory. For Sicily, it was the restoration of the old order. The mafia had gone from outlaw to ally in less than a year. The arrangement never really ended. During the Cold War, Italian politicians used mafia contacts to suppress communist movements in southern Italy. In exchange, the Cosa Nostra gained immunity, contracts, votes, and quiet control of the ports. The same pattern repeated elsewhere. Wherever the U.S. feared leftist revolution, it found someone in the underworld who feared it too. In France, after World War II, the Corsican underworld became a CIA partner. Marseille's waterfront, the setting for what the press later called the French Connection, was run by Corsican gangs who trafficked heroin refined from Turkish opium. American intelligence agencies tolerated it because those same gangs helped break communist-led dock strikes. The heroin reached New York through a network of couriers, feeding the addiction that tore through American cities in the 1960s. The moral contradiction didn't bother anyone. To fight communism, the West needed chaos in the right places and stability in the others. Crime provided both. The same logic fueled the global drug economy. In Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, the borderlands of Burma, Laos, and Thailand, became the world's heroin factory. During the Vietnam War, the CIA used Hmong and Shan militias to fight the Viet Cong. Those militias financed themselves with opium, flown out by American-linked airlines like Air America. By 1970, that same heroin was flowing back to U.S. streets, supplied through Corsican intermediaries and the American mafia. It was a perfect loop. Ideology one way, addiction the other. The Soviet bloc wasn't innocent either. Behind the Iron Curtain, smuggling was the only free market left. The KGB ran black market networks to obtain Western technology, sell weapons, and move gold. The Bulgarian Secret Service laundered money through Swiss banks. In the 1980s, the infamous Bulgarian umbrella assassination of dissident writer Georgy Markov in London revealed how thin the line between spycraft and organized crime really was. Intelligence agencies and syndicates used the same tools: shell companies, smugglers, assassins, and offshore accounts. Only the rhetoric changed. In Latin America, The Cold War produced a new breed of criminal, the drug lord as warlord. Cocaine, not ideology, became the currency of power. The first major cartel was born almost by accident. In the 1970s, small-scale traffickers in Colombia began consolidating to protect roots and profits. By the early 1980s, two major syndicates had emerged: Medellin, led by Pablo Escobar, and Cali, run by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers. Together, they controlled up to 80% of the world's cocaine supply. Their operations were multinational: farms in the Andes, labs in the jungle, distribution in Miami, money in Panama. The cartel's brilliance wasn't brutality, though they had plenty of that. It was logistics. They learned from the mafia and the CIA alike how to move product invisibly, how to buy politicians, and how to launder billions through the global banking system. The Medellin cartel's accountant, Roberto Escobar, once said, "We didn't invent corruption. We just paid better." The U.S. tried to fight the trade while secretly depending on it. During the 1980s, parts of the American intelligence network looked the other way as Central American rebels financed their wars with drug money. The Iran-Contra affair was the apex of that hypocrisy. Weapons sold to Iran, profits funneled to Nicaraguan guerrillas, and cocaine trafficked through the same routes. The press called it a scandal. The cartels called it Tuesday. Meanwhile, in Asia, heroin's golden era was giving way to methamphetamine and synthetic drugs. In Japan, the Yakuza were running construction projects and political campaigns. In Hong Kong, the triads controlled nightclubs and movie studios. In the Soviet collapse of 1991, Russian Vori rushed into the vacuum, taking over gas companies, banks, and shipping. Moscow's gangsters became oligarchs in tailored suits. Some bought soccer teams, others bought parliaments. By the late 20th century, the distinction between criminal and state had become mostly decorative. The Sicilian mafia was influencing elections in Rome. Colombian cartels were funding political parties. Russian syndicates were trading oil for influence. Intelligence agencies, corporations, and mobs operated on the same spectrum: secrecy, profit, and plausible deniability. And yet, for all the money and machinery, the logic stayed ancient. The mafia still used omertà. The triads still drank brotherhood wine. The Yakuza still practiced ritual loyalty. The Vori still tattooed their rank. The ceremonies of belonging outlasted every empire. The Cold War didn't change the underworld. It globalized it. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, everyone called it the triumph of democracy. What it really did was deregulate crime. The markets opened. Borders vanished. Suddenly, heroin flowed from Afghanistan, diamonds from Africa, and guns from Eastern Europe, all on the same planes that carried diplomats and aid. Corruption became the lingua franca of globalization. In 1993, the United Nations estimated that organized crime had become the world's largest employer. That same year, the Italian magistrate Giovanni Falcone was murdered by the Sicilian mafia in a highway bombing, 1,000 pounds of TNT under his car. Falcone had helped expose the mafia's links to banks, politicians, and foreign partners. His death was a message written in fire. You can't fight the system when the system is crime. The mafia bombings of the early 1990s in Florence, Rome, and Milan marked the end of the old romantic underworld. The new one was digital, transnational, and too large to see. The gangsters of the Cold War had become businessmen. Their weapons were offshore accounts and consulting firms. Their new soldiers wore suits and carried briefcases. By the time the Soviet Union was gone, and the cartels had turned cocaine into a trillion-dollar market, organized crime had completed its centuries-long transformation. It no longer lived in the shadows of civilization. It had moved into the boardroom. The state and the syndicate had merged, each learning from the other. Governments discovered how to profit without accountability. Crime learned how to govern without legitimacy. The two halves of civilization, law and corruption, were finally indistinguishable. By the 1990s, the old faces of organized crime were aging out, gunned down, arrested, or quietly retired to villas in the Mediterranean. But the underworld didn't shrink. It evolved. The global economy had gone digital, deregulated, and deniable. Money could move faster than law. Smugglers didn't need guns when they had shell companies, and laundering became a service industry. The mafia had always been a business. Now it was business. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the single greatest wealth transfer in modern history. In a few short years, billions in state assets, oil, steel, gas, gold, went up for sale at fire sale prices. Western advisors called it privatization. The Russians called it grab what you can before someone else does. Men who had started as black market dealers in Vory v. Zakone became billionaires overnight. Figures like Boris Berezovsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and Roman Abramovich used criminal networks, corrupt politicians, and ex-KGB contacts to seize entire industries. It wasn't theft, it was policy. When the dust settled, Russia had no middle class, just oligarchs and their muscle. The new capitalism looked a lot like the old racketeering. Those who refused to play the game didn't last long. Journalists were shot. Bankers disappeared. Reformers were exiled. The Russian mafia went corporate, its hierarchy flattened, its reach global. By 1998, the U.S. State Department estimated that Russian organized crime had infiltrated more than 200 major companies worldwide. And it wasn't just smuggling or drugs anymore. It was energy, real estate, and finance. The gangsters of the new age wore Rolexes and sat on boards. Meanwhile, in Latin America, the Medellin and Cali cartels collapsed under pressure from U.S. operations and internal wars. But their demise didn't end cocaine. It democratized it. Smaller cartels filled the gap: Sinaloa, Juarez, Gulf, and later Los Zetas in Mexico. Each more violent and militarized than the last. These weren't old-school families bound by oaths. They were private armies with corporate discipline. By 2006, the Mexican drug war had turned entire states into battlefields. Journalists were beheaded, mayors assassinated, police infiltrated. The violence was medieval, but the economics were modern. Multi-billion-dollar trade routes, logistics chains, data encryption, and global banking. The globalization that lifted legitimate business lifted crime right alongside it. When the World Trade Organization opened markets, when NAFTA cut tariffs, when the internet connected continents, the underworld celebrated too. Traffickers didn't need back alleys. They needed customs loopholes. Human trafficking networks, counterfeiters, and arms dealers piggybacked on legitimate shipping routes. By 2000, the United Nations estimated that 90% of global trade moved in standardized shipping containers. Nobody could check them all. Inside those steel boxes were everything from sneakers to cocaine to Kalashnikovs. And then came the banks. If the 1980s had made drug lords rich, the 1990s made them respectable. The old problem of organized crime was always what to do with the cash. You could stack it, bury it, or launder it, but you couldn't scale it. Deregulated finance changed that. The Caribbean, Panama, Switzerland, and later Cyprus became laundromats for dirty money. Offshore banking promised secrecy and speed. Shell corporations in the British Virgin Islands could own other shell corporations, creating a hall of mirrors where identity disappeared. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCI, was the prototype. A Pakistani bank that grew to 400 branches in 70 countries by the 1980s. It laundered billions for drug cartels, dictators, and intelligence agencies alike. When it collapsed in 1991, investigators found everything: CIA accounts, Medellin cash, and payoffs to terrorist networks. One British member of parliament called it the financial supermarket for crime. But there was no real punishment. The money had already moved. The same technology that globalized trade globalized crime. The internet gave syndicates anonymity, reach, and new markets. By the late 1990s, Russian hackers were stealing credit cards. Nigerian syndicates were running email frauds. Chinese triads were trafficking counterfeit electronics. Cybercrime was organized crime's natural evolution. No guns, no borders, and no extradition. A teenager in St. Petersburg could steal millions from a bank in London before breakfast. Governments tried to respond with new task forces and treaties, but their jurisdictions stopped at their borders. The criminals didn't have borders. They had servers. The FBI launched Operation Sun Devil. Interpol started cybercrime divisions. The results were cosmetic. In 2000, the UN estimated that organized crime accounted for 15% of global GDP. That's more than agriculture. By the turn of the millennium, the mafia was more concept than organization. In Italy, the old Cosa Nostra was under siege from prosecutors and pentiti, informants who broke the code of omertà. But its power didn't vanish. It decentralized. Calabrian and 'Ndrangheta clans took over cocaine routes from South America. The Neapolitan Camorra ran Europe's counterfeit goods and waste disposal industries. In Japan, the Yakuza controlled construction contracts and investment funds. The triads diversified into casinos, cyber fraud, and logistics. And in America, after decades of FBI investigations, RICO trials, and witness protection, the traditional mob had shrunk to a ghost of itself. But the business model survived in corporations, hedge funds, and political lobbies. The difference was legal paperwork. The methods, collusion, monopolies, payoffs never changed. If there was a capital of global crime in the 2000s, it wasn't Palermo or Chicago. It was Dubai. The desert city-state turned itself into a financial hub where billions moved daily with almost no oversight. Drug traffickers, oligarchs, and sanctioned governments all stored their fortunes there, under the banner of globalization. You could fly in with a suitcase of diamonds and fly out with an apartment deed. The old gangsters smuggled goods. The new ones smuggled legitimacy. Technology made crime quieter, but no less ruthless. The Sinaloa cartel tracked shipments with GPS. Russian hackers extorted hospitals with ransomware. The Yakuza used cryptocurrency long before governments knew what it was. Power was no longer about territory. It was about data. Whoever controlled information controlled money, and whoever controlled money didn't need guns anymore. The new underworld didn't wear uniforms or tattoos. It wore anonymity, VPNs, shell firms, and dark web handles. The digital mob was borderless, fluent in code, and infinitely scalable. It didn't fight wars, it ran servers. Its members never met. Its hierarchy was algorithmic. By 2010, the line between state, corporation, and syndicate had dissolved entirely. Governments used private contractors for intelligence work. Corporations hired mercenaries. Hackers sold information to the highest bidder. The old mafia dream of a government within a government had finally come true. Only this one was automated. The romantic age of gangsters with their fedoras and codes was gone. What remained was infrastructure, an invisible economy that outlasted ideologies. The mob no longer looked like a shadow of civilization. It looked like its blueprint. Every empire has an underworld, but by the 21st century, the underworld didn't need empires anymore. It had outgrown them. Governments rose and fell, currencies collapsed, revolutions came and went. And through it all, organized crime kept its pulse. Not because it was evil, but because it was useful. It became the connective tissue between power and profit, the business that outlived the kings. The story of organized crime is, at its core, the story of civilization, learning how to cheat itself efficiently. The same instincts that built the first gangs in Mesopotamia, protection, loyalty, leverage, now run multinational corporations and political parties. Only the branding changed. We replaced the word mafia with market, the cartel with conglomerate. The old handshake became a non-disclosure agreement. The same deal. Trust me, pay me, don't ask questions. Just move from the alley to the boardroom. When you look closely, every century's gangsters are just reflections of its bureaucrats. The Sicilian Don collecting insurance was the mirror image of the tax collector. The Yakuza boss enforcing Ninkyo-do was Japan's version of corporate loyalty. The Russian oligarch privatizing an oil field wasn't breaking the law. He was the law. Each age gets the criminals it deserves. By the early 2000s, crime had become inseparable from capitalism. Drug cartels diversified into mining, logging, and cryptocurrency. Triads partnered with real estate developers in Hong Kong. Russian syndicates invested in London property. Italian clans ran wind farms in Sicily, collecting EU subsidies meant for environmental projects. Crime didn't hide anymore. It incorporated. But for all its evolution, the emotional core of organized crime stayed the same. It's still about belonging in a world that doesn't offer much of it. Whether you're a peasant in 19th century Sicily or a hacker in 2025 St. Petersburg, the appeal is identical. Power without permission, family without judgment, purpose without morality. The mafia called it honor. The triads called it brotherhood. The Yakuza called it loyalty. The Russians called it the code. Strip away the culture, and it's all the same need. To build a world that feels more honest than the one above it. Even the rituals persist. The mafia still burns saints' cards in initiation. The Yakuza still cut off a finger in apology. The triads still swear oaths under incense smoke. The Vori still tattoo their history on their skin. It's not nostalgia, it's control. A system that remembers itself can't be destroyed, only renamed. By the mid-2000s, organized crime had woven itself into the global economy so thoroughly that experts stopped talking about it as a separate phenomenon. The World Bank estimated that illicit flows, drugs, human trafficking, counterfeit goods, corruption, amounted to over 10% of world GDP. The United Nations called it the shadow economy. But shadows don't disappear when you shine light on them. They just move. The irony is that organized crime didn't create inequality. Inequality created organized crime. Wherever power concentrates, someone will monetize access to it. When governments fail, criminals call it opportunity. When markets collapse, they call it diversification. When revolutions begin, they wait to sell both sides guns. The underworld doesn't believe in ideology. It believes in liquidity. And it isn't all blood and brutality anymore. In many countries, organized crime provides the only functioning services: water, electricity, medicine, protection. In Mexico, cartels pave roads. In southern Italy, mafia-run cooperatives employ more people than the state. In Somalia, pirates police shipping routes. Civilization has subcontracted its maintenance to its shadow. The final irony is that the mobster and the lawman are now chasing the same prize: stability. Governments want predictability. So do criminals. No one profits from chaos for long. The difference is moral, not operational. One calls it policy, the other calls it business. History tends to romanticize organized crime, the codes, the loyalty, the family dinners. But beneath the myth, it's always been bureaucracy by other means. The omerta, the oath, the ledger, they were all administrative tools. What made them powerful wasn't fear, it was efficiency. A mafioso and a CEO are both optimizers. One optimizes for growth, the other for control. When archaeologists someday sift through our time, they won't need to dig far to find our underworld. It'll be right there in the financial records, the shell companies, the campaign donations, the encrypted chats. We didn't bury our crime. We merged it with civilization. And like all mergers, it was mostly about convenience. Every age has believed it was the one that would end corruption, finally civilize greed, finally separate the wolves from the shepherds. But that's never been the point. Civilization and crime aren't enemies. They're collaborators, two halves of the same survival instinct. One enforces order, the other sells exceptions. Both exist because the human species can't decide whether it loves rules or loopholes more. The mob still exists, but its descendants no longer wear fedoras or carry Tommy guns. They sign deals in Dubai skyscrapers, trade crypto in Singapore, and fund political campaigns in Washington. They don't call themselves gangsters. They call themselves investors. The vocabulary changed. The math didn't. In the end, organized crime isn't really about crime at all. It's about systems, how humans build them, exploit them, and survive within them. It's the oldest economy, the first black market, the purest expression of supply and demand. We've tried to erase it for 6,000 years and failed because it was never separate from us. It is us, our reflection in the dark glass of power. Every civilization buries its dead and builds its monuments. The underworld does both, and every time a new empire rises, somewhere in its shadow, a hand is already counting the coins.